Good evening, Chris. Thank you, my friend. And thanks to you at home for staying with us for the next hour. On November 4th, 1995, the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, was assassinated. He was killed by a lone gunman as he was leaving a political rally. The Prime Minister was leaving a rally that was held in Tel Aviv. He was heading toward his car, and 3 shots rang out. 2 of them hit him. He was struck in the chest and in the spleen, and a few hours later at a local hospital, he died. Yitzhak Rabin was murdered by an Israeli extremist who was angry at him for having participated in U.S.-led peace talks a few years earlier. This is Prime Minister Rabin along with President Clinton and the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. After Yitzhak Rabin was murdered, world leaders essentially traveled en masse to Israel for his funeral, and it all happened really, really quickly. The Prime Minister was killed on November 4th. The funeral was held 2 days later on November 6th, and the world essentially coalesced for the funeral. The U.S. contingent for that funeral in 1995 was enormous. It included not only the current serving president, Bill Clinton, who was very close to Yitzhak Rabin, but also former President Jimmy Carter and also former President George H.W. Bush, 3 presidents traveling together on Air Force One to the funeral. There was also a big congressional delegation that went along, including the then Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. And that trip to Israel for the funeral of Yitzhak Rabin in November 1995, that trip, not the events that precipitated it, not the assassination, but the trip itself, specifically the flight, is in part how we got the 1995 shutdown of the federal government, which is the last government shutdown before the one we're in right now. Quote, Gingrich had been invited aboard Air Force One to fly to the funeral. With a budget crisis pending, he expected that President Clinton would take time out during the flight to talk to him about a possible solution. But President Clinton, who seemed to be genuinely grieving over Prime Minister Rabin's death, stayed up front in a cabin with former Presidents Jimmy Carter and George Bush on both the outward bound and return trips. Then, when the plane landed at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, Newt Gingrich and Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole said they were asked to deplane by the rear door. So 3 presidents out the front door, everybody else out the rear door. Newt Gingrich, a few days into the 1995 government shutdown, told reporters the story of that snub on the plane as his way of explaining why he had to play such hardball with President Clinton on that year's budget. Quote, I think that's part of why you ended up with us sending down a tougher budget resolution, Mr. Gingrich said. This is petty, and I'm going to say up front it's petty. But I think it's human. Look at this from the Baltimore Sun. Gingrich links stalemate to perceived Clinton snub. As he has done repeatedly since returning home from the Rabin funeral, Mr. Gingrich railed against Mr. Clinton's treatment of him. At a breakfast session with reporters, Mr. Gingrich said he was insulted and appalled that the president had failed to invite Republican leaders to the front of the plane. Mr. Gingrich says, where is their sense of manners? Where is their sense of courtesy? And thus was born one of the most famous newspaper front pages of all time. This was the cover of the New York Daily News 3 days into the 1995 government shutdown. Cry baby! Newt's tantrum. He closed down the government because Clinton made him sit at back of plane. And this was not something the press made up, right? This was the Republicans' own explanation of why they had to do what they had to do. Newt Gingrich says he sent the shutdown bill to President Clinton specifically because of the bad manners, because his ego was bruised, because he felt disrespected. Not realizing how bad that sounded to admit until it landed on the cover of the Daily News with him drawn in diapers, Republicans seemed sort of surprised by the backlash. But the crybaby hurting the country for no good reason narrative, the fact that they were hurting the country essentially as part of a tantrum over their hurt feelings, that revelation did really help ratchet up the pressure on the Republicans in 1995 and 1996. It ratcheted up the pressure so much, in fact, that they eventually gave in and eventually the government reopened. But you know what? It was not just that one time. And because you've been good this week and because it's been a long week, I'm about to show you something that will crystallize for you, that will remind you in very uncertain terms, very certain terms, why it is that you miss Barney Frank being in Congress. It was 5 years ago this week when we were in the midst of a different kind of crisis. We were in the midst of a financial catastrophe as a nation. That's when Wall Street was melting down and taking the country with it. This week, 2008. It was 5 years ago this week when Republicans, in the midst of that crisis, messed something up in the House. One of the most dramatic moments in that entire financial collapse was when Congress unexpectedly, surprise, voted against a rescue package for Wall Street to try to stop the meltdown. It was at a time when it seemed like Wall Street, indeed the whole financial system, might not be there at all the next morning unless the government took this action. And when Republicans in the House unexpectedly voted down that rescue package, this was the front page of the Daily News. The stock market plunged 777 points. It was the biggest point plunge of all time. And whatever you think of that vote on the merits, part of why it was so consequential at the time is that nobody expected it to fail. Republicans thought they had the votes. They said they had the votes. They thought it was going to pass. And then they put it on the floor and oops, what happened? This was the explanation they came up with for why they unexpectedly failed, why they could not count their own votes. This is what they said.
I do believe that we could have gotten there today had it not been for this partisan speech that the Speaker gave on the floor of the House. I mean, we've put everything we had into getting the votes to get there today. But the Speaker had to give a partisan voice that poisoned our conference, caused a number of members that we thought we could get to go south.
We did think we had a dozen more votes going to the floor than we had. No more than that, but we thought we had a dozen more. I think, unfortunately, too many of our members were already on the floor when they heard that late speech by the Speaker.
See, they would have voted to save the United States of America from financial catastrophe. They wanted to. But they found themselves unable to cast those votes because somebody else's speech hurt their feelings. They wanted to help the country. They did. They just couldn't anymore because their mellows were seriously harshed. Seriously. And this is why you miss Barney Frank being in Congress.
There's a terrible crisis affecting the American economy. We have come together on a bill to alleviate the crisis. And because somebody hurt their feelings, they decide to punish the country. Somebody hurt my feelings, so I will punish the country. I mean, that's hardly plausible. And there were 12 Republican members who were ready to stand up for the economic interests of America, but not if anybody insulted them. I'll make an offer. Give me those 12 people's names, and I will go talk uncharacteristically nicely to them. And tell them what wonderful people they are, and maybe they'll now think about the country.
And maybe they will now think about the country. Doing something that you know will hurt your country because you feel personally disrespected, because nobody has stroked your ego enough and complimented you enough and said nice enough things to you and let you use the more prestigious plane door. You know, it's just not a good look. It wasn't a good look in 1995. It wasn't a good look in 2008, and it is not a good look now. Behold Indiana Republican Congressman Marlin Stutzman. Marlin Stutzman, elected to the House in 2010. Last night, he told the conservative newspaper, the Washington Examiner, why it is so important for Republicans to dig in their heels and keep the federal government closed. Mr. Stutzman?
Yeah, we're not going to be, we're not going to be disrespected. And so that's where we're at today, where we have to get something out of this. And I don't know what that even is.
I don't know what that even... Why are we shutting down the government? I don't even know. What would it take for you to allow the government to reopen? I don't even know. I don't even know what that thing is that we need, but it better be something good. We'll come up with something that we want. We just don't want to be disrespected. That's why the government is shut down. When Newt Gingrich indicated back in 1995 that his government shutdown was the result of him being personally disrespected by President Clinton on Air Force One, Democrats and the president pounced.
Mr. Speaker, I had a traumatic experience on an airplane Monday. I asked for an aisle seat and they gave me a window. The pilot never came back to say hello.
Mr. Speaker, please quit whining.
Indicating the Speaker's tantrum is partly to blame for the government train wreck, the president today offered to apologize.
If it would get the government open, I'd be glad to tell him I'm sorry.
That is what day 3 of the great government shutdown of 1995 looked like. Here's what day 3 looked like this time around.
Just yesterday, one House Republican said, I'm quoting here, all right, because I want to make sure people understand I didn't make this up. One House Republican said, we're not going to be disrespected. We have to get something out of this, and I don't know what that even is. That was a quote. You have already gotten the opportunity to serve the American people. There's no higher honor than that. You've already gotten the opportunity to help businesses like this one, workers like these. So the American people aren't in the mood to give you a goodie bag to go with it. What you get is our intelligence professionals being back on the job. What you get is our medical researchers back on the job. What you get are little kids back into Head Start. What you get are our national parks and monuments open again. What you get is the economy not stalling, but continuing to grow. What you get are workers continuing to be hired. That's what you get. That's what you should be asking for. Take a vote, stop this farce, and end this shutdown right now. If you're being disrespected, it's because of that attitude you got. That you deserve to get something for doing your job. Everybody here just does their job, right? You don't, if you're working here and in the middle of the day you just stopped and said, you know what, I want to get something, but I don't know exactly what I'm going to get, but I'm just going to stop working until I get something, and I'm going to shut down the whole plant until I get something. You'd get fired. Right?
Democratic leaders in the Senate today said they are willing to offer Congressman Marlin Stutzman and House Republicans, quote, a group hug if it will end this government shutdown once and for all. A few hours later, Congressman Stutzman walked back his comments. He said he had carelessly misrepresented the Republican view of this shutdown. Anybody who believes it was a misrepresentation of the Republican view of this shutdown, raise your hand. Anyone? Come on. Anyone?
Yeah, we're not going to be, we're not going to be disrespected. And so that's where we're at today, where we have to get something out of this. And I don't know what that even is.